This is a real blitz today, and our first question is there any truth to the Sun headline about Putin's illness? And the Sun said a couple of days ago that spy documents claim that Putin has lost his mind and is taking a secret cocktail of drugs for multiple cancers and Parkinson's, and that's attributed to a Telegram channel that nobody can trust and to some supposed emails by somebody who supposedly is close to Putin. There's always a chance that stuff like this is right, but you can't trust it. In other words, it's overwhelmingly likely to not have epistemic credibility. I spoke to the Sun a few months ago to the young man who writes a lot of their Putin articles, and subtly my advice was obviously that you can't trust these Russian Telegram channels. But they also quote Solovey here, who is the lead informer that we have about Putin's health, the lead spreader of fairy tales about Putin's health, but not always fairy tales, so you never know. I'm a kind of a fan of this man Solovey, but obviously we can't give epistemic weight beyond a certain point to anything he says, and of course the article's relying on him too. So therefore my answer in total is no, you cannot trust that. There's no substantial, journalistically passable evidence about what's claimed in this article. I think there is some evidence that Putin is seeking a close association with particular doctors, and I think that there's a reasonable presumption that there's something going on, but there's absolutely no evidence that he is terminally ill. I mean, he could be, but there's just no evidence for that. How are Russians responding to mobilization now? Second question. Like this. And it goes like this into a people's war, or like this into screw Putin. And most people are still here. So it's at the moment a completely unresolved reaction, and the regime is battling for the people that do wake up wondering what's going on to then be sort of maneuvered into buying into the war. The political tool here that, really is almost the main purpose of mobilization, is to involve the population in Putin's war, except for that passive involvement that's already there that we've talked about. Which bit of Russian history is Putin is most like? 1930s? Maybe with a twist of 1848 till 1855, which is what Isaiah Berlin called the darkest hour and the night of 19th century Russian obscurantism. That was Nick I, who is a better model if you try to model Putin on a 19th century Tsar than Alex III, even though Putin models himself on Alex III. How do you speak to progressives like Briahna Joy Gray, who say that we are over-investing in Ukraine and need to focus on injustice at home as well as other humanitarian issues in other parts of the world? I haven't followed what Brie has been doing for the last year, so I don't know if she's doing well. Well doesn't mean right or wrong. Well means not lost her rudder, or if she's lost her rudder, as can happen to people who are focusing their life on sort of online communication. I heard just 2 minutes of a take she did on The Hill, which is that show that Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball used to do. Now they're doing Breaking Points, their own show. And I think she was saying that it's not clear to her why this has such grave humanitarian importance, because other bad things are happening in the world and we've got our own concerns here at home in the United States, she felt. So the answer there, if somebody like Brie wants to listen, is that there's a pattern of escalation that Putin is on, and that the reason to seek the understanding that this is a security threat to us isn't that it's a humanitarian crisis. It's that Putin has aspirations that potentially endanger European security. Kupchan piece, please comment in the New York Times. That's what everybody's been talking about. The piece I've got here, and I've skimmed it. Look, I can only say that my entire content, particularly on the first channel, is a sort of a concentrated statement on why I think Kupchan isn't correct. But let's dip ourselves for a second into it, even if I don't think I can say anything new. So Charles Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And the flavor is basically Ukraine's been doing an incredible job with the West's help, but now there's a wider risk of escalation, and there's a risk of economic blowback from a prolonged war that could undermine Western democracy. And, keeping the involvement of the United States, he says, at a level proportional to its interest is getting more difficult now as the war intensifies. Ukraine has already undertaken operations that have proved Vladimir Putin, that have provoked Vladimir Putin into even more reckless behavior. For example, Dugin killing and the Kerch bridge. It's not clear to me that's true, actually, that's provoked Putin. Not obviously true at all. The United States and its allies have been right to help Ukraine, and they should continue to help Ukraine. But they're also right to exercise prudence as they have, not doing the no-flight zone and so on. But now we need to seriously question how far Kiev intends to go. Ukraine's war aims are morally and legally warranted, but that doesn't make them prudent. The Kremlin may resort to nuclear weapons as things continue to go badly for it, especially if Ukraine wants full Russian expulsion plus Crimea. And if Mr. Putin goes nuclear, NATO would have to be involved. Ukraine's battlefield successes could go too far. And if the defense of Ukraine is not worth US boots on the ground, then the return of the Donbass and Crimea to Ukrainian control is not worth risking a new world war. Russia has already been dealt a decisive, if incomplete, strategic defeat. And then the economic dislocation of the war heightens internal threats to Western democracy and strains solidarity on supporting Ukraine. We're almost there. This is fertile ground for illiberal populism and the splintering of a transatlantic consensus on standing up to Russian aggression. Sooner or later, the West needs to move Ukraine and Russia from battlefield to the negotiating table. This is not going to be easy. Ukraine would need to back away from intent to join NATO. First, and second, there'd need to be a territorial negotiation that is so difficult, but you would start with Russia going back to Feb 23. And he concludes saying Washington's efforts to broker such a deal would open up a channel of communication with Moscow. We like communication between major powers during a crisis, reversing the dangerous fall-off in direct US-Russia contact. That is correct, actually. Helping Ukraine defend itself is a worthwhile and significant effort, but not at the expense of World War III or fracturing U.S. democracy. And at some point, he also says that the next necessary step is direct U.S. involvement in Ukraine's operational planning. It's not clear what that means, and I'm not a military expert to analyze it, but obviously it's going to be a conversation about whether that might not itself be an escalation. what do we say about this? I think that it's shameful to criticize this article as being something, unutterable or ghastly. We've got to accept that as an important contribution to the discussion, even if we know that acting on it may play into Putin's hands, even if that's the understanding that I recommend, which is it is. So I don't think that there is a possibility for negotiation at the moment. I don't think you're going to get Ukraine to negotiate, and Russia doesn't really want to negotiate. It wants to have a breathing space, it wants to replenish, but the story that I'm telling here, that's my assessment, is that the war doesn't end as long as Putin is either in power or undefeated. So that doesn't, however, make, and there's all the stories we've told about Putin's desire to escalate, how war is the telos of that regime. I don't want to recite all of that now because it'll be too brief and less compelling. But basically, I'm rejecting Kupchan's recommendation, welcoming his contribution, even though, of course, if we fight too much between ourselves over this, that this encourages Putin's strategy. But we've got to discuss this. It's very unhealthy to say that this is a view that shouldn't be ventilated by the New York Times. Of course it should. So the problem, though, is that my recommendation is dangerous. My recommendation of supporting Ukraine is dangerous because it puts us in a dimension of uncertain escalation. And escalation isn't just how far is Putin prepared to go. Don't think of it like that. Escalation, and that's why it's dangerous, is about a pattern of uncontrolled developments, whereby actor A is in a situation today which they couldn't imagine yesterday, and they're suddenly open to things that they couldn't imagine being open to yesterday. Actor B is consequently also in a similar situation. On it goes. So the approach I'm recommending has significant dangers. But back to Brie, too, we can't see this just as a humanitarian catastrophe. We've got to see this as a security threat, and I struggle to recognize any actionable room at the moment beyond just establishing lines of communication. Any actionable room for the kind of negotiations Kupchan is recommending. Dugin has said that Russia is fighting a holy war against the satanic West, and it's a matter of a final apocalyptic eschatological battle against the Antichrist. And that's been echoed by Medvedev's latest outburst. Could you comment? Well, look, much of the Russian establishment says that their foreign policy is a battle against the devil. Now that's an indication of significant political decline, if that's your foreign policy. If your foreign policy is a holy battle against devilish forces. Now, it's very important to acknowledge that that's not just rhetoric, that indeed, in historical terms, it's reasonable to say that over the last few years, the Putin regime has been trying to position itself as being at the vanguard of a global battle to asphyxiate the disease of Western liberal democracy. The fate of the planet rests in Joe Biden's hands. In his latest senior moment, he wrongly said his son died in Iraq and confused Iraq with Ukraine. Is this worrying? Even the New York Times wrote this up. with the headline, Biden verbally fumbles twice during campaign trip in Florida. So Joe Biden does connect Bo's death with Iraq, with the service in Iraq. What is going on? I think I'm going to put two things down. I'm an expert here, of course, because I couldn't talk, I couldn't walk for a period of my life. I still struggle with significant brain inflammation today. So I know what cognitive decline feels like. I'm pretty good at empathizing, actually, with people who are at a different point in life and are going downhill. So, two things. Is Joe Biden suffering significant cognitive decline? Yes. I mean, you've got to be out of your mind to not see that. You've got to be naive, at least, in terms of not so good at reading people. So don't tell me stories about his stutter, which is real. That's just, Joe is suffering significant cognitive decline. He knows it well, and he relates to it, I think, with a combination of arrogance. Screw it, I've been through the mill so many times. Me at 62% capacity, I can get through this stuff. So kind of confidence and arrogance about just being so at home in positions of power. And then fear. That fear that elderly people in decline feel when they momentarily sort of rewire themselves and bring themselves together around where am I, what is going on here. So that fear of, oh, I'm lost, is also something he feels, but overwhelmingly that gets outweighed by, damn it, screw it, I'm still fine. Now, so that's one part. I don't think this is affecting Biden's significant decision making. I think it's affecting his sort of day-to-day communication. It could affect small decisions, but I think that apart from his rhetoric, Biden's understanding of global risk is sound, and his capacity to act with confidence, both to follow advice he receives and to disregard advice he receives, is at the moment, I would say, luckily, far above anybody else who could have been president as a result of the last election in the United States. Maybe even above Obama. Obama would be not bad at this, but certainly far superior to Hillary and Kamala, and pretty much anyone who ran for the Democrats, at specifically sort of having real confidence around understanding the risks of World War III. So that's how it balanced the Biden situation. How intelligent and intellectually deep is Putin? Putin is one of the most formidable world leaders, but he is now a bad version of himself. So before he was unlovely to us, but efficacious. But now that efficaciousness is confined to areas that aren't sort of contaminated by his paranoia and his disconnection from reality. What gets Putin going in the morning? Resentment, sincerity, the desire to live, the thirst for phenomenology. I don't want to rave on and list 20 more things simply because there's just a question below that asks the same thing in a different way. So we'll say more about this in 30 seconds. How would you feel if there were Russian culture but no Russia as a polity? I'd personally feel nothing. I mean, I'm partly Russian psychologically, and it just is irrelevant to me whether the Russian state exists or not, except in terms of the practical consequences of that for the world. But personally, Russian culture doesn't go away just because the Russian state goes away for me. So emotionally, that means nothing. But then, more substantially, I actually think it's important for Russians to begin exploring that possibility, not necessarily as a goal, but as a destination. What's the most dangerous thing about Putin? We've just begun to talk about this. So let's say that it's really that he, too loud, sorry, that he puts himself at the center of an historical process. And he thinks that there's a kind of extraordinary reality to this project of trying to resuscitate a magical past, which he doesn't think it's magical, but his sense of the past is magical. So this sort of magical thinking about resuscitating a past, combined with putting himself in the center of that history. Putin no longer thinks that his role in history is contingent. He thinks there's something natural about the position he's in, and that makes him particularly dangerous. By the way, if you're watching this and you're not subscribed to my main channel, and I've realized that that's the case with some of you, do realize this is our second channel. There is also a main one. Go there, have a look at what's around, in case you are the 10% of people here who haven't. Lots of love and toxin.